All right, everybody, onward to episode number 6. This is the final one. So they're going to address the abandonment of the gold standard, and we're going to see if extra credits has actually going to come up with why the abandonment of the gold standard is a good thing, or is it only a good thing if you are a government that is in debt? Let's continue.
Series, we rarely get far into the 20th century because it's hard to have historical perspective on events that are that close to our own time. But today, we're gonna have to roar into the latter half of the 20th century to show you just how recently this idea came to be. This idea that seems so normal, that we all take for granted as if it were always the case. The idea that money is worth something because we all agree it is.
Okay, this is kind of I would have to say, an isolated bubble of doing this notion, right? If you live in the United States and you've always been able to take a dollar bill to the store and get something to it, this idea has value. And if you've been in most of the industrialized world and you haven't had any major currency crises within your lifespan, then yes, you've got this idea in your head. But if you're from Argentina, if you're from Venezuela, if you're from any country that's had their governments toppled, like Iraq or Libya, if you're from anywhere where you've had problems get bad enough that the government has resorted to cheating, then this idea could be completely destroyed in your head, that government issued paper currency equals value. I mean, ask an Argentinian. They will, you go to large portions of the world, and yeah, they'll have their own paper currency. There's a paper currency that you can get in pretty much every little country. But when you go there, half the time, they'll be using US dollars instead of using whatever their local currency is. Or people will actually prefer to keep those. And that's because in so many of these countries, the flaws of the paper money system are so glaring, and their governments abuse them so frequently that they have to trade with a more reputable country. They would rather store US dollars than, say, store whatever the currency is in Argentina or Mexico or Zimbabwe. Anywhere where, the currencies have failed. And you might say, well, that's just because they're sucky countries, and that'll never happen in a big part of the world. But that's just kind of short-term thinking, because almost all of these big countries at some point have broken their promises. And, usually the promise is the gold standard. And all that is how corrupt the government is. So basically, in the scenario that they're about to outline, and I'm predicting here, but I know a little bit of the history. They're going to say that, this paper money is a good thing because it's allowed the governments to do all sorts of crazy stuff and improve the economy. And that's kind of arbitrary because we didn't really have this problem before. I outlined it, that the problem is that the government's in debt. And the government and people don't like paying direct taxes. And so how can the government get around that problem? It's only really a problem for the government. It's not a problem for people who work in the economy. It's only a problem for debtors. And so the system is actually attacking the other set of people, which are people that work in the real economy and that are savers. And yes, people in other parts of the world may prefer the US dollar over their paper currency because their government is more corrupt than the US government. But that doesn't mean, say, the US government or the European Central Bank or anybody else isn't as corrupt and that they haven't done negative things. Basically, when you get a situation like this, it's called being the cleanest shirt in the dirty hamper. I've bloviated a lot, so let's see what they actually have to say.
Last time, we talked about the growth of central banks as a patch system to fix the numerous problems that occur when you introduce paper money as the basis for an economy. But for many people, one more step was required to really inspire confidence in this idea of taking milled tree bark in return for their labor, and that was the gold standard. The gold standard is basically the idea that your paper money is backed in gold, that at any time you could take your paper bills somewhere and redeem them for a specified amount of gold. Now, I hear a lot of you say, why would you ever do that? Doesn't putting a currency on the gold standard just mean that we're back to the problem we were trying to solve in the first place? By tying money to...
Again, not really a problem unless you're a debtor and don't have a real way to get out of debt.
gold, aren't we once again limiting the money supply? The short answer to that is yes, and we're gonna see just how that plays out. The longer answer is, sort of. This is a pretty complicated economic question, too complex to really get into here, but the concise version is that having paper money backed in gold, rather than using gold directly, allows far more options when you need to expand the money supply. And it has the advantage of letting you play fast and loose with the system when you need to. But still, why would you do this rather than have your currency float free? Well, that's where history comes in. You see, the gold standard solves two major problems. The first is inflation. As you can probably guess, it wasn't long after people started printing paper money that they figured that they could just print a lot of paper money.
Yes, thank you.
Way more paper money than they could ever redeem. Way more than even our fractional reserve banking system thinks is sane. As soon as people did that, you started to get inflation. And it could still happen even with a central currency controlled by the government, because when countries needed to, say, pay for an army, they would sometimes just print more bills to do it. More bills means that each bill is worth less, which was a problem, not only for those poor citizens whose life savings were now in paper bills, but also for other countries who'd been accepting those paper bills in exchange for their goods. Which brings us to the second major issue that the gold standard addresses: exchange rates. Right as paper money was becoming the standard in Europe, international trade was really starting to pick up. The Industrial Revolution was getting into full swing, and raw materials and finished goods had to be shipped and traded at a pace never before seen. Simultaneously, mercantilism, that isolationist monetary policy that we discussed in an earlier episode, is coming to an end, causing trade to rocket to even greater heights. But what happens when your ship full of cargo docks in some foreign port, and you try to hand the local merchant your funny green paper money to buy their goods, while they try to hand you their funny pink paper money to buy what you've got on your ship? Well, you both just sit there scratching your heads for a while. Back in the day, you would have just weighed whatever coins they were trying to give you and accept them for their weight in gold. But
Ding, 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 ding.
now they're handing you this piece of paper that you don't recognize and you have no idea how to value. I mean, can you even trade this specific piece of paper for anything when you get back home? But if both currencies are on the gold standard, problem solved. Just as an example, let's say that at any time, you could turn in $20 to get 1 ounce of gold. 1 ounce of gold is what your $20 are worth. Now, let's say you sail to England, where, for the sake of keeping things simple, the UK has set their gold standard so that an ounce of gold is worth 2 British pounds. This makes everything nice and simple. Since you're both operating on the gold standard, that means 1 British pound is the equivalent in value to 10 US dollars. Done and done, simple. So how does this all fall apart? Well, first we have to talk about how it all began. If you saw our episodes on the First Opium War, remember how we talked about the fact that all of Britain's silver was flowing into China to buy tea? Well, to solve all the problems I just talked about, the British were looking for some commodity to back the Bank of England notes with. But with all their silver gone, the British chose gold, and soon basically everybody followed suit. But this system had its own breaking points. Absolute adherence to the gold standard had to be suspended several times during the 1800s due to the massive expenses incurred by international war.
Okay, they're basically making the
By
point
international war.
This is the point. That this entire system is made to fund warfare state. I mean, this is bad. Okay? So, the more money we give, the more of this we get. Okay? I don't know why we would want this. Why would we want a system that forces people to fund wars? Isn't it better if wars come to an end as quickly as possible? And if a war is really desperate, isn't it better to have an honest system fund the war than a dishonest system which defrauds people by inflating the currency? I mean, I understand why they do it. They do it because in a war, there's no hold barred and you break whatever promises that you need to break. But understanding this, understanding that governments do this, why would you ever want the paper currency for long term storage of wealth? If you know that the government does this every time there's a war, every time there's a big expenditure, every time they need to cheat on something, that they go to this system. They have to break the gold standard. Well, you can go buy gold right now. Yeah, it's not exactly a fair system the way they've got it set up right now, but you can go and exchange dollars and get gold, and at least in the United States, it's not illegal, and they're not going to VAT tax you or any of that stuff like they do in some countries. But basically, why would you be a victim of a warring government with a war that you don't particularly agree with? Because if I agree with the war, I'm going to buy a war bond. If I don't agree with the war, I am going to buy gold and bury it. And so anything that basically this is a system by which governments harvest ignorant people. They harvest these ignorant people who believe that this has become a legitimate store of wealth and but it can be corrupted at any time by a government. And so in such a way, they take people who are ignorant of the history on this subject and get them to put their savings into paper currencies, into various paper currency derivatives like banknotes or bonds. And then when push comes to shove, they don't go to Congress and ask for a tax increase. They don't come out and say, will you please buy war bonds? They just take it. They just print the money and take it. And so what you're seeing is an authoritarian system that is subverting what would otherwise be a democratic or voluntary system, where if they had to use the democratic process to raise taxes, or if they had to use a legitimate economic process to convince people to purchase war bonds. Let's continue.
But in England, as in most other countries, there was always a return to the gold standard in peacetime, with countries working to build their gold reserves back up and limiting the printing of further notes. Other minor shocks, like the California Gold Rush and other introductions of massive new sources of gold, would cause the system to lurch, but overall, use of the gold standard held up pretty well throughout the 19th century. Then came World War I, the seminal catastrophe, the shatterer of so many notions from our past. And like so many other things, the gold standard crumpled under the impossible needs of the war. Nation after nation abandoned gold to print more money to pay for the arms, munitions, and men that were being expended daily on the field.
Okay, let me ask a question, extra credits. If World War I was smaller, because governments could not get arbitrary funding by stealing purchasing power from their constituencies in their countries, and let's say that instead of World War I consisting of 6 boxes, it only consisted of 2 boxes. And instead of however many millions of people dying, only a third of the people died. Aren't you basically decreasing the severity of something that people don't really want? I mean, it's a legitimate question that in and of itself is not a good thing, because anything that can be used by one side can be used by the other side. So there's a Central Bank of England, and if you want to see the Allies as being the good guys in World War I, and that's not necessarily something that you can just, everybody just writes themselves as the good guys when they win, right? So there's nothing stopping, Germany has a central bank, right? And England has a central bank, and then they have this war. And if the war was a third the size or a tenth the size because people realized the war was bullshit and they didn't lend the government money or they didn't buy war bonds, then the war ends more quickly and you don't have a system where so many people are dying and the war ends and we get back to peaceful productivity and living quicker than we would if we had these horrible governments that could just steal money from ignorant people in order to fund a bigger war.
Field. And as more and more money was printed and spent to feed the insatiable hunger of this war, trade became erratic. Trade from the United States grew far beyond what the gold reserves of Europe could bear. Inflation ran rampant, and after the war, many countries couldn't drag themselves back to the gold standard. Some nations, like Germany, who were spiraling into hyperinflation under the crushing debt of war reparations, tried to stabilize their currency by backing it in land rather than gold. Others, like England, appealed to people's patriotism and wrenched themselves back onto the gold standard by asking people not to redeem their money for gold just out of love of country.
This is what you're supposed to do. If I believe that the war is a good thing, then I will lend the government money. If I do not believe the war is a good thing, I will not lend the government my money. This is how it's supposed to happen. If you just put all the power into a government, then you get corrupt government. You know, you have all the power, you have all the money, you have all the power. And power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's the only thing that has been shown to me so far here.
But even this fell apart as the Great Depression hit. Those few countries that had the wherewithal to stay on the gold standard, like the United States, were now hamstrung by how the inflexibility of gold prevented them from reacting to the crisis. And yet, many people and many nations thought of this as a temporary hiccup. Sure, the war and the Depression had made a mess of things, but soon the good times would be back. Things would get sorted out, and everybody would get back on the gold standard. I mean, they had to, right? Without the gold standard, how is money worth anything? But those good times didn't have a chance to come back, because then came the big one, World War II. World War II was perhaps the most expensive war in history. Economically, it was totally unsustainable, with the US racking up enormous trade surpluses and every other country involved sinking into massive debt. But the world had learned from World War I, and as World War II wound down, many of the major powers met to work out the first real international monetary agreement, the famous Bretton Woods system. You see, following the First World War, Britain had owed the US a huge pile of money, which they couldn't pay back unless France paid them a huge pile of money it owed them. But much of the war had occurred on French soil, and the French couldn't afford to pay back the British unless they basically made the defeated Germans pay for everything. This, of course, had all been a disaster that caused huge financial and political...
Yeah, war. A wasteful war is the... See, here's the thing. It's not the gold standard that is bad. It's the war that is bad. Okay? That's the core theme here that I'm taking away, is that the ability for the government to cheat their populaces of their money, of their purchasing power, only makes the wars worse. It doesn't make the wars better.
Instability. So this time around, things would be different. Reparations would be minimized. Repayment of reparations would be on gentler terms, and that whole problem of wildly unstable currency caused by countries like Germany no longer being able to adhere to the gold standard after World War I, this time the currency instability problem would be solved. And how would it be solved? Well, at this point in history, the US basically had everybody's gold, because everybody had bought a ton of stuff from the US for the two biggest wars in history. So the US actually was still on the gold standard. So the solution was simple. Peg everybody else's currency to the US dollar. That's right, the system essentially boiled down to the US dollar is redeemable in gold, and all other currencies are redeemable in US dollars. And so every country had to keep some dollars on hand to redeem their currency, which is how the US dollar became the reserve currency for basically the entire world. As other nations' economies recovered, the dollar became overvalued. This came to a head in 1965. Charles de Gaulle, who had always been a little bit miffy about America's position in the world, decided that he was going to act on that redeemability. So he sent the French Navy to cash in and pick up his bullion, literally bringing boatloads of gold back to France. Soon, other nations followed suit. By 1971, with the dollar still overvalued and the Cold War and wars like Korea and Vietnam draining US resources and sending US gold overseas, Richard Nixon finally took the step that many argued had to come, and took the US dollar off the gold standard.
So basically, we broke the trust that everyone else had in us. We told a lie to the rest of the world that if you held our money, we would redeem it in gold. And once we were unable to hold up to that bargain anymore, due to our own bad actions, due to our own corrupt actions in being unwilling to fund our own wars and fund our own welfare state and our other government expenses, because of our unwillingness to appropriately go through and solve those expenses, we instead cheated the rest of the world that had trusted in us. That's the only way I can really portray this. Let's keep going.
Just take that in for a moment. 1971. Less than 50 years ago. But here's where it gets...
Fun fact, the average age of a monetary system is 40 years. And I'm going to go into more of this in probably like an addendum, so I won't spoil it for now. But we are going to see another change in the economic model because the system is in its final stages, and yes, it can take many years to end, but it is in the process of ending.
It's good. When Nixon pulled the US off the gold standard, the shock was felt around the world, but it didn't stop many countries from still pegging their currency to the US dollar.
This is what we call the cleanest dirty shirt in the dirty hamper. It doesn't mean that the United States wasn't corrupt and lying and cheating. It's just that we were lying and cheating less than a lot of the other people were.
So now you had currencies around the world redeemable for US dollars, and the US dollar pegged to nothing. Soon, many other countries decided just to let their currencies float, to let them be valued at what the market would bear. And so, just like that, almost by accident, after 6,000 years, we finally accepted money as an idea rather than a thing. Or, as John Law would say, we accepted money as the medium by which things are exchanged, not the value for which they are. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.
Okay, so basically, Extra Credits has gotten to the end of the gold standard, and they have effectively declared happily ever after, that this system is established, there's no problems with this current system, and we're left with nothing better than what you get in a fairy tale when the hero and the princess ride off after the supposedly dragon being slayed off into the sunset. They haven't given us any real answers about what has gone on and what has happened, and is this a good thing or a bad thing. They've just said, this is how we got to here. They haven't made any, and I guess from a historical perspective, that's kind of a good thing, that you're not taking one side or the other if you're just trying to present history. But I'm still going to take the materialist bent here, that if the system produces a better outcome or reduces bad things, then that's what you really want to look for in your system. And one of the major things that this system has enabled is bigger wars. I mean, that's just the most glaring thing that has stood out to me in this entire process. It's like, well, what is our justification for this? Well, having a really big war is our justification for this. And that's not a good thing. It's just not, no matter how you slice it. War is one of the most wasteful and destructive things in the process of the system. So if by centralizing our currencies into the hands of a central bank and governments has allowed those same governments to engage in more and bigger wars, then that is actually a bad thing. And if anybody from outside wants to take anything away and criticize me, that's what I want you to look at. That's my central argument here, is that it's not necessarily a good thing that all of this power has been centralized in the hands of governments, because they can do bad things with that power and have frequently done bad things. And if it was necessary to, say, fight defensive wars, they could have done alternate means like selling war bonds, or like actually going through the democratic processes and taxing people to do those things. But the fact that they didn't is basically playing on people's ignorance. And when you're playing on people's ignorance, I don't see how you can take that as a good thing. That basically you're making a promise to someone and then you're breaking that promise because people are ignorant of history. And I really don't see how you can ever make that into a good thing. So I'm not going to do I'm going to do one more chapter based on this. It's not going to be based on anything that Extra History is going to do. I'm going to basically kind of narrate another chapter. We've gotten to Nixon, and then I'm going to give you the History of Paper Money Part 7 by Frank Johnson. And I'm going to describe to you what has happened since the end of that system and how we haven't really solved anything. Because basically, the gold standard is about trust. And breaking the gold standard is about breaking trust. And you can't really operate a system without a system of trust. You'll hear something called like trustless systems, and it's because the system is set up in such a way that you don't need, and this is usually cryptocurrency, so we're getting off the track here. But I'm going to give you the next chapter that the History of Paper Money from Extra Credits has not given you so far. And I hope you guys have found this interesting and entertaining, and I will see you for that addendum next time.